In 1860, one English county held the largest cotton industry the world had ever seen. 2,650 mills, 440,000 people at the machines, 30 million spindles turning at once, and in a single year they sent out 2.78 billion yards of cotton cloth. The county was Lancashire, its capital was Manchester, and the world called it Cottonopolis because it clothed the world and there was no second place. Today, the biggest of those mills is flats. You can rent a one-bedroom in the brick where the fine yarn was spun, and the agent will not mention the yarn. This is the story of how one damp corner of England became the only place on earth that could spin the world's cotton, and then taught the world to do it without them. Keep one number back, 440,000. It comes back at the end, and it will not be about mills. Chapter 1. The wet air and the soft water. Start with the ground, because the ground was here first. Southeast Lancashire is a hard place to keep dry. The air comes in wet off the Irish Sea, and it hangs there, damp, most days of the year. For a farmer, that is a curse. For anyone trying to spin a fine cotton thread, it is the single most useful thing in England, because dry thread snaps and damp thread holds, and here the air did half the work for nothing. Under that wet sky ran soft water off the hills, the kind that washes and bleaches cloth without staining it. Under the water sat coal, enough to raise steam in every valley. Near the coal sat salt, which makes the acids and the bleaches that a dye trade needs, and 35 miles to the west lay the sea, and a river running up to it, so raw cotton could come in and finished cloth could go out. None of that was planned. It was simply true before anyone arrived to use it. There was one more thing, and it was an absence. Manchester had no guild. The old cloth towns of England were run by ancient companies that decided who was allowed to trade and who was not, and Manchester, an overgrown market town of perhaps 10,000 people, had none of that. A man with an idea and no permission could just begin. So they did. What every one of them was really operating, though none of them would have put it this way, was a machine that did not fully exist yet. The logic of it was already lying in the ground. One kind of engine turning raw cotton into thread faster and cheaper than any human hand would pull the whole world's cotton toward whichever place built it first. The wet air and the soft water and the coal had already decided that place would be here. The men only had to arrive and switch it on. They arrived. In 1761, a canal reached the town carrying cheap coal from Worsley. Manchester's first cotton mill went up in the early 1780s. By 1800, the town was, in the phrase of the day, steam mill mad. And by 1801, its population had passed 70,000. And on the northeastern edge, in a district called Ancoats, the mills began to rise in long rows beside the water, the first place on earth built from nothing around steam. The oldest of them, Murray's Mill, went up in 1798, story upon story of brick beside the canal. Keep that image, the brick going up by the water, in the wet air, for one purpose only. The mills were built to spin cotton. Chapter 2. The Scots in Ancoats. The men who switched it on were not from here. In 1788, a young Scot named James McConnell walked into Manchester from Kirkcudbrightshire, in the far southwest of Scotland, with a trade in his hands and very little else. He was a machine maker. He built the spinning mules the new mills ran on. A few years later, another Galloway man, John Kennedy, came down the same road, trained to the same work, and in 1795, the two of them went into business together. They did not set out to spin cotton. They set out to build the machines that spun it. Then a customer ordered 2 mules from McConnell and never paid, and he was left holding the machinery. So he used them himself. That is the whole accident at the root of one of the largest cotton firms in the world. 2 unpaid for machines, and 2 men who could mend anything. It worked because they built and repaired their own mules, which no rival could match for cost, and because they got into spinning early, before it took a fortune to start. By 1798, they had put up their first mill in Ancoats, the old mill, 7 stories of brick on Union Street beside the Rochdale Canal. They spun the fine stuff, the high counts, thread so fine it went into lace, and the sheerest muslin, counts of 100 and more when the ordinary trade worked at 40. The fine counts needed the best raw cotton, and the best was Sea Island cotton, long in the fibre, grown on the coastal islands of South Carolina and Georgia. It was picked by enslaved people. The letters are still in an archive in Manchester, orders sent from Ancoats to name plantations, the price and the grade of the crop, set down in a clerk's hand. The thread that made the firm was drawn, at the far end of it, from people who were owned. The firm grew on it. 300 workers by 1802, 1,000 by 1816, one of only 4 businesses in the town employing more than 700. By the 1830s, more than 1,500, more than any other spinner in the district. Around them, Ancoats filled in. Mill after mill went up along the water, 6 and 7 and 8 stories of red brick, chimneys standing between them, until the district was the first place on earth built from nothing to house machines and the people who fed them. The smoke sat over it. Inside, men and women and children worked the long day among the belts and the noise, and the name Ancoats became a byword for what the new age cost the people who lived in it. Men like McConnell did not cause the age. The damp and the coal and the machine had already set the terms. But somebody had to arrive and take them up, and the men who did got rich. The mills were built to spin cotton. Chapter 3. The hand that wasn't needed. There was a flaw in the machine, and the flaw was that it needed a man. The spinning mule did a beautiful thing. It drew the cotton out into thread and twisted it and wound it on, all in one long stroke and return, and it made yarn finer than any hand had ever spun. But it could not be left alone. On the return stroke, a skilled spinner had to guide the carriage back in by feel, easing the thread onto the spindle so it did not break. Get it wrong, and the whole drawer was spoiled. So every pair of mules had a man on it who knew the work in his hands, and that man could not be quickly replaced. Those men knew it. The mule spinners were the best paid workers in the trade, the barefoot aristocrats of the factory floor, and they organized. They paid into unions, they held their nerve in a dispute, and they could stop a mill by walking off the one job nobody else could do. In the 1820s, with the old laws against combining repealed, they pushed hard on their rates. The masters looked at the men who could halt the machines, and they wanted them gone. So they went to an engineer. Richard Roberts worked in Manchester and was one of the finest machine makers in England, a man who could make metal do almost anything. The masters asked him to build a mule that ran itself. In 1825 he did it. His self-acting mule carried the spindle carriage back on its own, with a mechanism where the trained hand had been, and it took the skill out of the spinner's arms and put it into the iron. It did not empty the mills of people. It ran on cheaper ones. The self-actor could be minded by less skilled hands at a fraction of the wage, and the proud spinner found that his one advantage had been engineered out of the work. And there was a second thing quieter that nobody in that room needed yet. A skilled spinner was a Lancashire man. He had learned the craft over years in these mills, in this wet air, and he could not be posted abroad like a crate. But a machine that no longer needed his skill was a different object. A machine that ran itself, could be drawn on paper, built to the drawing, shipped anywhere on earth, and set going by hands that had never been near Ancoats. The masters had solved the problem in front of them. They had a machine that did not answer back. They did not notice that they had also built the one that could leave. Chapter 4. The Room That Priced the World. By the middle of the century, Manchester had started to hand the spinning to someone else. The mills in the town itself peaked in number in 1853, at 108, and then began to fall, not because the trade was shrinking, but because it was moving out to the towns around, to Oldham and Bolton and Bury, where land was cheaper and a mill could be built bigger. Manchester kept the part that mattered most. It kept the money. What the town became was a counting house for the cotton of the world. The yarn and the cloth were spun in the satellite towns and carried into Manchester to be sold, and the selling was done from warehouses that looked like palaces. Along Portland Street and Whitworth Street they went up, monumental blocks of stone and brick, some of them as grand as a town hall, where the finished goods were graded and packed and stamped Manchester, and sent out under that name to every market on earth. A buyer in Lagos or Calcutta or Buenos Aires did not ask which Lancashire town had woven his cloth. He asked for Manchester goods. At the centre of it stood one building, the Royal Exchange. Queen Victoria gave it the word royal after she visited in 1851. And by then, it was already the place where the price of the world's cotton goods was settled. It was a market with almost nothing physical in it. There was no cotton on the floor, only men, thousands of them, buying and selling by word and by note, agreeing what a yard of cloth was worth before it existed. Around them, the town built everything a trade needs. The world's first modern railway had opened between Liverpool and Manchester in 1830, moving goods in hours that had once taken a day. The merchants came from everywhere, German and Greek and Armenian and Jewish houses. One of them, a man of 21 from Frankfurt named Nathan Rothschild, settled here in 1798, bought his cloth straight from the mills and turned £20,000 into 60. He kept a small book with samples of the cloth pasted onto its pages, a record of what the world had ordered. Within a dozen years, he had gone to London to deal in gold instead, and made himself the richest banker in Europe. The town minted men like that, and could not always keep them. His bank would help pay for the ship canal in the end. By 1871, this single district was working almost a third of all the cotton spun anywhere on the planet. And then Manchester did something that showed exactly how much it believed in itself. It sat 35 miles from the sea, and it resented paying Liverpool's docks and Liverpool's railways to handle its goods. So it dug its own way to the ocean. Across the 1890s, it cut a ship canal over the plain, deep enough for ocean-going vessels, and in 1894, a city 35 miles inland became one of the busiest ports in Britain. It was the largest river navigation canal in the world, and Manchester was certain it would carry cotton for 100 years. The mills were built to spin cotton. Chapter 5, 1913. This was the top. It does not come again. At 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon in 1913, the floor of the Royal Exchange is full. More than 10,000 men are members here, and on high change. Twice a week, several thousand of them are in the room at once. Too many for the great hall to seat, so they stand. The light comes down through a glass roof onto a floor, marked out in small squares, and on each square a firm has its pitch, and a man waits at his pitch to be found. There is no cotton in the room. The raw cotton is bought and sold 35 miles west, in Liverpool. What changes hands here is what Lancashire has spun and woven from it. A sample of cloth in a pocket, a folded note of counts and prices, a quiet word, a nod. In this room, this afternoon, the clothing of most of the human race is being priced. A shipper who knows the taste of one town in West Africa is selling to it. A merchant who knows the exact width a Calcutta buyer wants is buying for him. The whole planet's cotton passes through a hall a man could cross in a minute, and it passes through Manchester because there is nowhere else for it to go. Out beyond the roof, the numbers are at their height. By 1912, the country holds more than 50 million spindles, almost all of them in Lancashire. And in that year, Lancashire spins and weaves more cotton than it ever has or ever will. The men on that floor even had a chief of a kind. Sir Charles Macara, a Scottish minister's son who had come to Manchester as a boy and risen to run one of its great spinning firms, had spent 20 years organising the masters of Lancashire into a single federation, and had tried to bind the cotton nations of the whole world into one agreement, as though the trade could be run forever by men of goodwill in committee. He would live until 1929, long enough to watch the thing he had built begin to die. The men on the floor believed with good reason that it would all go on. It will not go on. And the thing that ends it is already being written down in the same careful hand that wrote the cotton orders in government offices during the war that is coming. When the First World War breaks out, Britain needs cloth and cannot spare the ships to carry Lancashire's exports around the world. So the government helps build spinning mills in India, the very market Manchester had clothed for a century. The mills there are fitted with machines built to Lancashire drawings, machines that no longer need a Lancashire hand. They are copied, they are improved, they are run for wages no English mill could match. Manchester had spent 100 years teaching the world what it knew. During the war, it finished the lesson. Nobody on the floor felt it. High change went on. The board still moved. The room did not know. It had just seen its best year. Chapter 6. The Cotton Nobody Names. Step back from the trading floor because there is a second story running under the first, and it is the one the boom was built on. The cotton that fed Cottonopolis did not come from nowhere. Almost all of it came from the American South, and almost all of that was grown and picked by enslaved people. The fine Sea Island thread that made McConnell and Kennedy, the middling American whose price moved across the board at the exchange, the whole raw material of the richest textile district on earth, was the product of slavery. Manchester did not look at that too closely. It priced the cotton. It did not price the picking. Then, in 1861, it could not look away. The American Civil War broke out, the Union blockaded the southern ports, and the raw cotton stopped coming. What followed is remembered as the Lancashire Cotton Famine. The blockade takes most of the blame, though the trade had also overproduced, and unsold, Manchester cloth was already stacking up in the warehouses of Bombay when the war began. Whatever the mix of causes, the effect was brutal. Within a year or so, around 3 in 5 of the region's mills stood idle. Hundreds of thousands of workers were put on short time or thrown out of the mills entirely in a district that had no other trade to fall back on. They queued for charity and relief. Families who had lived on cotton went hungry. The story usually told about what happened next is a clean and noble one. In the winter of 1862, a great meeting was held at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester, and the working people of the city voted to support Abraham Lincoln and the blockade, to stand with the Union and against slavery, even though the blockade was the very thing starving them. They sent Lincoln an address. He wrote back on the 19th of January 1863 and called their stand a sublime Christian heroism. Unmatched, he said, in any age or country. Years later, a statue of Lincoln was raised in Manchester, and his letter was cut into the stone beneath it. The clean story is true. It is also not the whole of it. Lancashire was divided. Plenty of mill owners and shipping men wanted the blockade broken and the Confederacy recognised, so the cotton would flow again. Nearby, Liverpool leaned openly toward the south. The famous meeting was a mixed gathering of middle-class citizens and workers, not a hall of starving spinners alone, and the region never spoke with one voice. History kept the noble version because it is the one worth keeping. But underneath both versions lies the same hard fact. A trade that made a few men enormously rich ran, at one end, on people who were owned, and at the other end, on people who could be starved by a decision taken an ocean away. When the reckoning came, it did not land on the men at the exchange. It landed on the hands at the machines, more than half of them women, who had built none of the fortune and were first to lose everything. That was always the shape of it. The wealth went up. The cost went down. Chapter 7. The Machine Ships Out. The fall did not come from a rival Manchester could see and fight. It came from itself, arriving late. The peak was 1912. Then the war took the shipping, and the government built those Indian mills to Lancashire's own drawings, and when the war ended, the world had changed while Manchester was looking the other way. The old markets did not come back. India had learned to spin its own cloth on Lancashire's machines, and it began to shut British cloth out, taxing it and boycotting it. The man who led that boycott came to Lancashire to see what it had done. In September 1931, Gandhi arrived at a station near Darwin late at night. In the homespun cloth he wove himself, and several thousand cotton workers came out to meet him. They were the people his boycott had helped put out of work. 10,000 of them idle in Darwin alone, and they cheered him anyway. When a weaver told him how bad things were, he said, "My dear, you have no idea what poverty is." The boycott was only a small part of what was killing Lancashire, but it was the part that had a face, and the face was spinning its own thread. Then came Japan. In 1933, Japanese mills went to 24 hours a day, ran the same kind of machinery around the clock for wages Lancashire could not touch. And in that year, Japan passed Britain to become the biggest exporter of cotton cloth in the world. The thing Manchester had been for a century, the workshop that dressed the earth, now belonged to somebody else. For a while Lancashire told itself this was a slump like the others, that the good years always came back in the end. They did not come back. It was not a dip in a rising line. It was the line itself, bending down for good. The numbers turned, and once they turned, they did not stop. Every decade after the war, Lancashire's share of the world's cotton trade was smaller than the decade before. The mills that had run day and night ran short time, then a few days a week, then not at all. In 1958 came the line nobody in 1913 could have imagined. Britain, the country that had spun for the whole planet, became a net importer of cotton cloth. It was now buying in from abroad the one thing it had taught the abroad to make. The government tried to manage the dyeing. In 1959, it passed an act to modernize the trade, which in practice meant paying mills to scrap their machines and clothes. Through the 1960s and 70s, the mills of Lancashire shut at close to one a week, until the towns named for the trade had no trade left. None of it was a defeat in battle. It was arithmetic. The machine that had made one district the only place on earth that could spin the world's cotton was the same machine that, once it could be built and run anywhere, made that district unnecessary. The mills were built to spin cotton. They could spin it still. The world had simply learned to spin it cheaper on the machine Manchester gave it. Chapter 8, 440,000. Here is the number that was held back at the beginning. 440,000. That was how many people worked in the cotton mills of this one county in 1860 at the trade's full height. Not spindles, not looms. People standing at the machines, more than half of them women, across 2,650 mills in Lancashire. It was one of the largest workforces ever gathered into a single industry in one place, all of them doing versions of the same thing in one corner of one country. The number was never about the mills, it was always about them. Across the century after the peak, that workforce was taken apart. Not in one closure, not on one terrible morning, but slowly, a mill at a time, so that a person could give a whole working life to cotton and watch the trade shrink around them the entire way. A spinner taken on as a boy before the First World War could still have been alive when the last mill in his town shut. Fathers taught sons a trade that would not exist by the time the sons were old. The skill that had taken generations to build in the hands of one county drained out of it inside a lifetime or two. And it fell on places that had nothing else. These were not cities with a dozen trades, where one lost industry is a wound the rest can carry. They were towns built from nothing around cotton, named for cotton, that had never needed a second answer to the question of what they were for. When the cotton went, the answer went with it. The work that had pulled hundreds of thousands of people in from the fields a century before had nothing to offer their great-grandchildren, and it did not send them back to any field. It simply stopped, and there was nobody to blame for it, which made it worse. No army had come. No single owner had shut the gates on a chosen morning that a town could remember and hate. There was only the arithmetic, spread thin across 70 years and 100 towns, until the total came to nearly everything. A place can stand together against an enemy. It is much harder to stand together against a sum. The end even has a date on it. On the 12th of March 1982, Queen Street Mill in Burnley wove its last commercial cloth. It was the last steam-driven weaving shed in the world, down by then to 440 of the looms it had once run, its engine named Peace after the dead of the First War. The steam was let down. The shed went quiet. A working life Lancashire had kept going for 200 years, stopped in one room on an ordinary Friday. 440,000 at the machines in 1860. By the 1980s, in any commercial sense, none. A whole way of living built up across 100 years and taken down across another. That is the number. It was never mills. It was the people the mills were built around, and then built without. Chapter 9. What the brick holds now. Go back to Ancoats, because the brick is still there. The mills on Red Hill Street still stand. The McConnell and Kennedy mills and Murray's mills beside them, 7 and 8 stories of red brick along the old canal. They do not spin anything. Royal Mill and Paragon Mill are flats now. Behind the tall windows where the mules once ran are kitchens and sofas and people at laptops. The ground floors are coffee shops and a bakery and a gym. Ancoats, the first industrial suburb on earth, the district that once horrified the reformers who came to write about the New Age, is now one of the most sought-after postcodes in the north of England. A flat in the old mill that went for £50,000 about 20 years ago sells for 6 times that now. Almost none of the people who live there have ever touched raw cotton. Not all of it survived to be saved. Across Greater Manchester, close to half of the mills that were still standing in the 1980s have since been pulled down. For every mill that became flats, another became rubble, and then a car park or a shed. The ones that are left are the lucky ones, and there is a whole effort now, with council money and heritage grants, to keep them standing. The thing that was once so ordinary here that its smoke blacked the sky is now rare enough to protect. Out in the towns beyond the city, it is quieter still. Oldham, which spun more cotton than any town on earth, spins none. Bolton, which they nicknamed Spindleton, has no spindles running. The towns that were named for the trade kept the names and lost the trade. Walk into the city centre and the warehouses are there. The palaces on Portland Street and Whitworth Street, where the finished goods were graded and stamped Manchester. They are hotels now, and offices, and more flats. The firms' names are gone from most of them. The buildings kept the swagger and lost the reason for it. At the middle of it, the Royal Exchange still stands. Trading on the floor stopped on the last day of 1968. The Great Hall did not fall into ruin. A theatre company hung a room of steel and glass inside it, a thing like a landed spacecraft, and put on plays where the cotton was priced. Around the edges, an arcade sells watches and jewellery and wedding dresses. And above all of it, if a person looks up, the old trading board is still on the wall, still showing the closing figures from that final afternoon in 1968. Nobody has changed the numbers. There is no longer anyone whose job that would be. Round the corner in Lincoln Square, the statue of Abraham Lincoln stands where the city moved it. The square lately dug up and relaid. Lincoln turned to face the west. His letter to the working people of Manchester is cut into the stone below him. When the pedestal was carved, the word men was quietly changed to people, because more than half the workers who paid for that stand had been women, and the record was set a little straighter than the letter itself had left it. And out past the city, the canal is still open. The one Manchester cut to carry its cotton to the sea for 100 years still moves freight every week, under a private owner now. It carries oil and steel and containers and machine parts. Within the last year, there have been fresh plans to build new terminals along it. The docks at the far end became Salford Quays, and the sheds there fill with television studios instead of bales. The canal does the exact job it was dug to do. It simply does it for everything except cotton. That is what is left. A canal that carries the wrong cargo. A board that shows a dead price. A statue whose inscription was corrected. And the mills. The mills are the thing to end on, because they were the thing it began with. The brick going up by the water, in the wet air, for one purpose only. That purpose is finished. The cotton is gone, and it is not coming back, and the machine that carried it away was the one Manchester built. But the brick did not leave with it. Tonight there are lights on in Murray's mill, and warm rooms, and people who have never seen a spindle turn. The mills were built to spin cotton. They stand there still in the same wet air, and they do not know that anything has ended.